I stand in my childhood bedroom on Christmas morning, surrounded by packed boxes, watching my father's face drain of color as he reads something on his phone. My mother clutches my brother Ryan's arm while he whispers desperately about damage control. The acceptance letter from the Chicago International Design Institute sits prominently on my desk next to a printed email confirmation, signifying my secret escape. My family finally realizes they severely underestimated their supposedly obedient daughter. I wasn't just leaving, I was taking the foundation of their lives with me. Have you ever been the invisible child while a sibling was treated like a golden god? Drop a yes in the comments if you know the feeling of working twice as hard for half the credit. I looked at the clock, it was 8:15 a.m., the sun was rising over the Boston skyline, but inside this room, the air felt like a frozen job site. David's voice cracked the stillness like a structural failure. You think you're so smart, Olivia, he spat, his hands balling into fists. If you don't apologize to your brother right now, I'm cutting the line. No more tuition, no more support. Consider your schooling suspended until you learn your place in this family. His threat hung in the air, hollow and weightless. He thought he still held the deed to my future. He thought my education was a subscription he could cancel, but he hadn't checked the records. My response was a single breath of cold air. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't reach out for a hand that had only ever pointed at my brother's trophies. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I was the silent investor in their version of family, and I was finally calling in the debt. Ryan stood behind him, looking like a crumbling monument. The golden boy was tarnishing in real time. His eyes were wide, fixed on the notification glowing on his phone screen. Please tell me you didn't send it, he whispered, his voice sounding like dry paper. Dad's smile froze mid-breath. He looked at Ryan, then at the packed boxes scattered across my floor. The realization was beginning to leak into the room like a slow flood. Send what? He asked, his voice dropping an octave. I stepped toward my desk, my movements precise and methodical. I was no longer the spare daughter sitting at the edge of the table. I was an architect, and I had already identified the fatal flaw in our family structure. I've already audited the situation, I said, my voice as flat as a blueprint. At 12:01 a.m., while you were all sleeping off the Christmas Eve dinner I funded, I officially revoked Ryan's access to my private design servers. Every rendering, every structural calculation, and every groundbreaking blueprint he claimed as his own has been wiped from his local devices. Ryan staggered, his hand reaching for the wall for support. It was more than just a loss of files, it was a loss of identity. My institutional credentials at the academy have certain administrative privileges, I continued. One of them is the ability to flag fraudulent submissions in real time. I didn't just lock the doors to my studio, I burned the entire site. I've already filed a formal notification with the Academic Integrity Board, flagging his entire Pritzker Young Architect entry as a fraudulent submission using my Chicago login. I knew the board had received my report at midnight, but they chose to remain silent, giving Ryan one final chance to prove himself, or more likely, to let him dig his own grave in front of the entire faculty. David's face went from pale to a dangerous shade of crimson. You would destroy your brother's entire career over a petty misunderstanding, he roared, the veins in his neck bulging. This is about family, Olivia, we protect each other. No, I said, looking him straight in the eyes without blinking. This isn't a misunderstanding, this is a balance sheet. For 22 years, I was the one footing the bill for his failures. My compassion was a luxury you both overdraft until there was nothing left. I didn't destroy this family, David. I just stopped being the glue that held your lies together. I walked back to my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a liquidation, and I was just getting started. The studio in our basement always smelled of drafting ink, ozone from the 3D printers, and the cold, metallic scent of ambition. For 6 months, that space was my sanctuary and my cell. My family saw me as the ghost in the machine, the girl who did the grunt work while the golden boy prepped for his Boston fellowship. They didn't realize that every hour I spent in that dim blue light, I was measuring the distance between my reality and my freedom. $180,000, that was the value of the scholarship I'd earned with my independent urban planning project. Ryan didn't just borrow a sketch or skim the surface, he cloned the entire methodology. He presented it to the Boston Academy as his own Pritzker entry, basking in the praise of professors who had never seen the original source. And then there was the embezzlement, $120,000 that my grandmother left in a trust for my care and education. David and Jennifer didn't even blink when they siphoned it off to fund Ryan's luxury SUV and a penthouse lifestyle they thought he deserved. I kept my head down, I stayed silent. I've heard the questions people ask survivors of environments like mine. Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you scream the moment you saw the theft? I call it the invisible chain of the survivor. I lived in a house where the walls were made of their expectations and the floor was made of my silence, a prison without bars. My silence wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the patient planning of an architect. I knew that if I pulled the support beams too early, the whole house would collapse on me instead of them. I had to wait for the concrete to set. I had to wait until my transfer to the Chicago International Design Institute was ironclad. I had to wait until every institutional report was filed and every fraudulent file Ryan held was tagged for deletion. I remembered the night I found Ryan in the studio, his face lit by the glow of my monitor. He didn't even look guilty when I walked in, he just told me he was checking his email. I felt a clinical detachment replace the old hurt. I checked the system logs after he left. He had downloaded 3 gigabytes of my research files, my heart, my soul, and my entire professional future. I watched my mother buy expensive champagne to celebrate her genius son using money that was legally mine. My compassion was a luxury they had overdraft for years until the account was empty. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore, it was a hostile takeover. I was the silent investor in Ryan's fraudulent success, but as I stood in my bedroom on that Christmas morning, the investment period was officially over. It was time for the liquidation to begin. Jennifer's performative sobbing stopped as abruptly as a power failure. She wiped her eyes, and for a second, I saw the predator behind the pearls. She didn't look at me like a daughter, she looked at me like a malfunctioning piece of equipment that was threatening her most valuable asset. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick document. It was a legacy transfer agreement, drafted by the family firm weeks ago. They had been waiting for this moment. They wanted me to sign over every scrap of intellectual property for the urban design project, granting Ryan full rights to the work he'd already stolen. It's for the family name, Olivia, she whispered, her voice like sandpaper on silk. Ryan is the face of our legacy, you're just the support. Sign this, and we can tell the Academy it was all a technical error. We can save his fellowship, we can save our reputation. I looked at the document. It was a contract for my own erasure. I realized then that I was caught in the trap of normalized cruelty. For years, they had convinced themselves that stealing my future was a necessary sacrifice for their golden boy. In their minds, my talent wasn't my own. It was a resource to be mined for Ryan's benefit. This is how toxic systems function. They normalize the unthinkable until the victim is the only one who sees the bars. They were suffering from a profound narcissistic injury. By exposing Ryan, I hadn't just reported a crime, I had shattered the mirror they used to see themselves as successful parents. They couldn't handle the sight of his failure because it was their failure too. David stepped forward, his shadow eclipsing the acceptance letter on my desk. If you don't sign that, Olivia, the audit begins today, he said, his voice cold and transactional. We've calculated every cent we've spent on you, tuition, housing, the interest on the loans we supposedly provided. It comes to $550,000, we will call that debt in immediately. We will bury you in litigation before you even step foot in Chicago. $550,000, it was a manufactured number, a financial death sentence designed to force my compliance. They were betting that the weight of that debt would crush my resolve. They thought I was still a child who feared their balance sheets, but I was an architect. I knew how to read the fine print of a collapsing structure. My compassion was a luxury you both overdraft for 2 decades, I said, my voice clinical and quiet, and this ultimatum is the final proof that this house was built on a foundation of sand. I didn't reach for the pen, I reached for my coat. The air in the room was toxic. A thick fog of entitlement and unearned authority. I looked at the 3 of them, the thief, the architect of lies, and the enabler, and I realized I didn't owe them an apology. I didn't even owe them a goodbye. I owed myself a future that didn't involve their permission to exist. I carried the last box to my car, the cold Boston air stinging my cheeks like a million tiny needles. I didn't look back at the house that had been my prison without bars. I didn't need to. In my head, their words were still echoing, but for the first time, I wasn't asking what I had ever done wrong. I was documenting what they had. The sound of the front door clicking shut was the purest sound I had ever heard, the finality of a structure that had outlived its stability. It was a moment of structural rebirth. I was no longer a piece of the furniture they could move. I was the architect of my own exit strategy. The drive to Chicago was 14 hours of silence and gray asphalt. I watched the familiar skyline of Boston fade in the rearview mirror, a crumbling monument to a life I no longer occupied. I stopped making their morning coffee. I stopped answering the frantic, entitlement-laden texts that vibrated against the passenger seat like a dying heartbeat. For 22 years, I had been the silent investor in Ryan's version of family. Now, I was finally calling in the debt. I don't remember how long the drive actually lasted. All I know is that by the time I saw the Willis Tower, I wasn't the same person anymore. On January 1st, I stepped into my new apartment near the Chicago International Design Institute. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I didn't waste time unpacking boxes. I had an audit to conduct. I met Julia that afternoon in a high-rise office that overlooked the lake. Julia was sharp, methodical, and had been a family law attorney for 10 years. More importantly, she was a specialist in intellectual property. Anger wasn't loud as we sat across from each other. It was clinical, following the proven storytelling formula. I knew it was time for the professional escalation. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I handed her the folder containing 7 years of evidence. We began the systematic process of justice immediately. Julia didn't just draft a letter, she designed a legal cage. We started with a formal cease and desist against Ryan, demanding he immediately withdraw any materials associated with the urban planning project from the Boston Academy. But that was just the perimeter. The real strike was the audit demand. I told Julia about the trust fund my grandmother had established for my care, $120,000 that David and Jennifer had embezzled to fund Ryan's luxury SUV. We filed a formal demand for a full accounting of that trust, along with a notice that we would be pursuing criminal charges for misappropriation of funds if every cent wasn't returned. The stakes had shifted from a family dispute to a multi-state legal war involving the architecture board and the district attorney. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed. As I walked out of Julia's office, the Chicago wind felt like a cleansing draft through my soul. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was executing a plan. The concrete was set, and it was time to remove the support beams. The Boston Ivy Academy Auditorium was a space of brittlest concrete and high-stakes silence. Ryan stood at the podium, projecting my stolen blueprints onto a screen the size of a billboard. He looked every bit the architect of the year. Wearing a $1,000 suit and a smile built on plagiarism, he was halfway through explaining the innovative cantilever design of the community center when the Structural Integrity Committee member leaned forward. The air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. As an architect, I knew the sound of a structural failure long before the physical collapse. In this case, it was the sound of a committee member's pen hitting the table. Ryan had reached the section of the project I called the fatal flaw. When I realized he was downloading my files 6 months ago, I didn't stop him. I didn't password protect the folders. Instead, I redesigned the load-bearing calculations for the central atrium. I left a mathematical ghost in the code. On a laptop screen, the design looked magnificent, but in the real world of gravity and physics, the atrium was a death trap. The cantilevered roof lacked the necessary tension supports, a mistake so fundamental that no licensed architect would ever miss it. Ryan, however, wasn't an architect. He was a thief who didn't understand the language of the soul he was trying to sell. Dr. Johnson, the committee head said, her voice like a cold chisel on stone, could you explain the support distribution on page 42? These numbers suggest a catastrophic failure at 60% load. Ryan's smile didn't just freeze, it crumbled. He stammered something about a software glitch. He tried to pivot, to use the charm that David and Jennifer had spent 25 years polishing, but the committee wasn't my mother. They didn't care about his golden boy status, they cared about public safety. This was the lethal discovery I had planted. Following the professional escalation, the conflict had moved beyond a family dispute over property. Ryan, desperate to save his reputation, did exactly what I predicted. He produced a set of corrected safety data. He pulled up a secondary file on the screen, claiming he had already identified and resolved the issue. That was the kill shot. Those corrected files contained falsified stress test numbers that were mathematically impossible. He hadn't just stolen work anymore. He had actively forged safety documentation for a public-use structure. The committee didn't just disqualify him. They hit the emergency alarm. Within minutes, the campus security was replaced by the presence of the Regional Architectural Board's legal counsel. This wasn't about a scholarship or a fellowship anymore. Ryan had moved from academic theft into the territory of criminal public endangerment. As he was led from the podium, his face was the color of unmixed plaster. I watched the live stream from my studio in Chicago, sipping my coffee with clinical detachment. The once invincible structure of the Golden Boy hadn't just cracked, it had undergone a total structural collapse. My silence wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the patient planning of an architect who knew that the only way to truly destroy a lie is to let it bear the weight of its own gravity. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening in late February. I looked through the security feed and saw them. David and Jennifer were standing in the hallway of my Chicago building, but they didn't look like the imposing architects of my misery from Christmas morning. They looked like a structure undergoing a total collapse. David's suit was wrinkled, and Jennifer's pearls seemed heavy, weighing down her hunched shoulders. They smelled of stale coffee and the kind of fear that only comes when the Foundation of a lie finally gives way. I opened the door, but I didn't invite them into my space. This sanctuary was built on my own merit, and their entitlement had no permit here. Olivia, Jennifer whispered, her voice cracking like a dry timber, please, everything is falling apart. Ryan is facing a felony charge for public endangerment because of those files. David stepped forward, his eyes red and his voice stripped of the unearned authority he had wielded for 22 years. The academy has revoked his fellowship, and the regional hospital is suing us for $550,000 in damages. They're claiming the protocols he developed were a lethal liability. We'll lose the house, Olivia, everything we worked for. I leaned against the doorframe with clinical detachment. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was a balance sheet. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were simply shocked that I had stopped playing along. You need to fix the files, David pleaded, his hands trembling as he reached for a dignity that was no longer there. Tell the board it was your mistake. Tell them the load-bearing calculations were a glitch in your software. You're his sister. You're the only one who can save his reputation. I looked at the two people who had embezzled $120,000 from my trust fund to buy a luxury SUV and a penthouse lifestyle for their golden boy. They were standing on my threshold, asking the silent investor to bail them out of a bankruptcy they had manufactured themselves. My compassion was a luxury you both overdraft for 2 decades, I said, my voice as cold and level as a concrete slab, and the account is officially closed. I reached for the folder on the table behind me. I didn't offer them a chair or a glass of water. Instead, I slid a copy of the criminal indictment and my own $120,000 embezzlement lawsuit across the floor. I didn't destroy this family, I said, delivering the final blow with lethal precision. I just stopped being the glue that held your lies together. Jennifer collapsed against the wall, sobbing, but the sound didn't move me. I felt no sadness, no panic, and no regret. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The audit is complete, I told them as they stared at the legal papers. I've already filed for the recovery of my inheritance, plus interest and damages. You chose the golden boy, you chose the performance, now, you get to live in the structure you built. I didn't wait for a response. I closed the door, and the heavy click of the deadbolt was the most satisfying, ironclad sound of my life. The news from Boston arrived in a legal folder that felt lighter than it should have. The structure of Ryan's life didn't just crack, it was systematically dismantled by the weight of its own gravity. The professional authorities officially revoked his degrees. Citing 7 years of pervasive and documented fraud, the Boston Ivy Academy followed suit immediately, stripping him of the fellowship and banning him from the professional architectural community for life. He wasn't the genius of the family anymore, he was a case study in the catastrophic failure of a life built on structural theft. David and Jennifer were the next to be liquidated, to cover the $550,000 liability from the lawsuit and the court-ordered restitution for my embezzled trust fund. They were forced into a fire sale of the family home. The shrine they had built to Ryan's lies was auctioned off to the highest bidder to pay for the cost of their enabling. I heard through my attorney that they moved into a cramped rental on the outskirts of the city, living among the debris of their own design. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I didn't feel joy, and I didn't feel malice. This wasn't revenge, it was a completed audit. I stood on the balcony of my new firm, overlooking the Chicago skyline as the winter sun dipped below the horizon. The wind was cold and cleansing. In my hands, I held a scale model of my first independent project, a community shelter for at-risk youth. It was being funded entirely by the $120,000 I recovered from my inheritance, plus interest. It was a structure designed to protect the vulnerable, built on a foundation of absolute truth. For 22 years, I had been the silent investor in a family that treated my compassion like a resource to be mined. I had lived in a prison without bars, believing that blood was a contract I couldn't cancel. But as I watched the city lights flicker to life, I realized that blood is just DNA. It is a biological accident, not a structural requirement for a meaningful life. I realized that sometimes, the only way to build your own life is to burn down the house that was built on your silence. I had to let the cracked foundation of my past collapse to realize that I was the architect of my own exit strategy all along. I am no longer a piece of the furniture they can move. I am the creator of my own horizon. True revenge isn't about destroying them, it's about becoming the person they said you'd never be. If Olivia's journey inspired you, share this video with one person who needs to find their own foundation. Subscribe for more stories of justice.